Welcome to the All Out Leadership Podcast, hosted by Pastor Eric Lawson, where each episode is uniquely designed to help you live all out by bringing you practical leadership from a biblical perspective delivered in 10 minutes or less. So whether you're a business leader, serving in ministry, or simply looking to grow in your leadership, this podcast is for you. Before we dive into this week's topic, make sure to subscribe to the podcast and download the show notes at ericlawson.com/podcast. And while you're at it, feel free to share the content on social media. Now, let's join Pastor Eric for this week's conversation.
Welcome to another edition of the All Out Leadership Podcast. Today, we're going to talk about being first place in second chair. Coming in first place in the second chair. When we come to the end of David's life, there's one of the most beautiful chapters, I think, in his whole story, and it's found in 2 Samuel chapter 23, where there are mighty men listed, 30 mighty men, and there's the chief three, and we're going to unpack a little bit of that today. When you read the story of David, he's an incredible leader. He's a man after God's own heart. He's the standard by which God measures every other king. But there is a group of people behind him that help lift up his hands and make him a great success. It's like that saying, behind every successful man, there's a surprised mother-in-law or a better woman. So inside of the life of David and the life of every great leader, there is a great team behind that person. And I want to talk to you today because maybe you're part of that team that makes the pastor look good. You're part of that team that makes the CEO, the boss look good. And what I love is that God made sure that these great people who fought with David, stood with David, helped David succeed, were recognized and honored. Because, you might be one of them today. You might feel that you're in the second chair, that you're always looked over, you're left out, and that maybe you aren't, on the cover of the magazine, and, you aren't the one that's getting invited to share about the success of the company, although the boss that's talking about it is really just sharing everything you actually do and taking credit for it. Just know this, God sees it, and what I love is God made sure that these guys were recognized. They weren't recognized as much in the story, but we come to the end of the story and they're recognized. And there's just going to be some people who come to the end of their life, and before God, they will be recognized. And I love the story I once heard of a missionary who was coming back from Africa. Him and his wife, they were on a steamship and they were coming back. They'd spent over 40 years of their life just giving of themselves to people inside of the nation of Africa, in the deep jungle and the villages. And as they were coming back on the steamship, President Teddy Roosevelt was also on that steamship, and he was coming back from Africa. And he had gone to Africa for a safari hunt. So he killed a rhinoceros and some other exotic animals. And there were crowds of people waiting to greet Teddy Roosevelt. And there were bands playing music, and they were cheering, "Welcome Teddy Roosevelt," because he had a safari. Well, that missionary had spent their entire life. They didn't have anybody there. There was no parade for them. Nobody there was welcoming them home. They just slipped off the ship and kind of faded into the darkness. And it really bothered him. And he was complaining to his wife, and then he was complaining to God, like we all tend to. And he was just disappointed. And God spoke to him at night, and he said, "But you're not home yet." And there are times in our life that we look around and we see everybody else getting celebrated. And I think the Holy Spirit would just say to us, you know what? Your day's coming. You will be recognized and you will be rewarded. So don't lose heart. If you're second, just remain satisfied. Just keep being faithful. Keep doing what you're doing, and you will stand before God one day and you will hear him say, "Well done, good and faithful servant." Next week, we're going to get into a couple characteristics that made these great leaders so great.
Thank you for joining us on the All Out Leadership Podcast. We hope you gained new biblical insight that challenged you to grow in your leadership. If you've enjoyed this week's episode, we would love your help in getting the content out farther. You can help by subscribing to the podcast at ericlawson.com/podcast and telling others about it. Next week, Pastor Eric will be back with another episode. So until then, we hope you have a great week being an all-out leader.